Alma Reed had lived alone on her farmland for years. To the drilling men who came in boots and tailored suits, she looked like nothing more than an old black woman with no one to back her. Quiet, isolated, an easy target. They offered money, then pressure, then violence. Tires slashed, animals poisoned, a deadline issued. But what they didn't see was the past she carried years as a military sniper, wars fought in silence, battles won in shadows. So when they came in the night to take what was hers, they met something they never expected. Alma didn't fold. She fought like the war had never ended. The morning unfolded with the kind of quiet grace that only land tended by memory could offer. As the first blush of gold spread across the tips of the pecan trees, Alma Reed stood at the edge of her porch with a mug of coffee held steady in her right hand, her gaze sweeping over the wide expanse of farmland she had inherited, protected, and learned down to the last root and furrow, as if every inch were stitched into the fabric of her skin. At 74 years old, her back remained straight, her steps deliberate, her breath calm. Not because time had spared her, but because she had spent a lifetime training her body to answer only to discipline. Not fear, not pain, and certainly not threats. The house behind her, modest but fortified in the ways that mattered most, was kept in perfect working order, not for visitors, for there were rarely any, but because order was the language she understood best. Nothing in Alma's life was left to chance. The curtains were drawn in the same rhythm. The stove cleaned the moment it cooled. The porch swept in even strokes whether the wind had been kind or cruel the night before. Her land was more than a home. It was a perimeter, a responsibility, a living extension of every lesson war had carved into her bones. She had always known the soil beneath her boots held stories older than the house. When she began noticing small disturbances in the soil line near the northern field, the faint chemical odor rising after a storm, the subtle discoloration in the water runoff, the way her late husband's old geological notes hinted at what might lie deep beneath the surface, she didn't panic or celebrate. Instead, she made her own assessments, gathered samples, and, without telling a soul, initiated the slow, legally intricate process of securing her mineral rights through a lawyer she trusted 3 counties away, a man who owed her more than one favor and knew better than to speak her name aloud in a public office. It was a quiet maneuver, as careful and calculated as any mission she had led in uniform. Yet, even with every precaution, the news seemed to travel on wind she couldn't trace. Weeks after the filings began, strange trucks appeared near her road. First parked off the gravel shoulder, then moving closer each time, always with dark, tinted windows and clean white exteriors that stood in sharp contrast to the dust-covered locals who worked this land for real. The men inside didn't wear uniforms, but their posture gave them away. Too relaxed for regular contractors, too alert for salesmen, with eyes that scanned the horizon like men used to walking into rooms they intended to control. The first time one came up her driveway, he wore a smile so polished it seemed to reflect the sun. Dressed in a button-down shirt rolled to his elbows, sleeves deliberately casual as if to appear approachable. The sharpness in his voice carried the clipped edge of a man unused to being ignored. He introduced himself as a representative of a real estate development group with interest in strategic rural acquisitions, and said his team had heard about the value of her land, hoping to make an offer that respected her legacy while providing freedom to enjoy her remaining years without burden. She didn't invite him to sit or offer coffee. She listened without blinking, her silence stretching just long enough to force a flicker of discomfort across his confident face. When he handed her a pristine envelope with gold lettering along the flap and suggested she think it over, she took it without a word and waited until he left before opening it. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the cicadas filled the dusk with their pulsing rhythm, she stood alone at the edge of her field, the envelope open in her hand, the offer inside staring back in bold, unapologetic print. A sum so large it might have made another woman pause, maybe dream. But Alma only tilted her head slightly, looked out across the land she had bled for, worked for, buried a husband on, and guarded for decades. Not because it was lucrative, but because it was hers in every way that mattered. She didn't hesitate or sigh. She walked back to the house, opened the iron stove door, and fed the offer to the flames, watching without emotion as the paper blackened, curled, and turned to ash. Her face bathed in the soft flicker of heat meant, in her world, A line had been crossed. No retreat, no negotiation, no warning the next time someone came asking about what lay beneath her ground. By morning, the ash from the envelope had cooled into a soft gray layer at the base of the stove, the only visible evidence of the decision sealed in her mind. Alma rinsed her mug, tightened the laces on her boots, and stepped onto the porch with a calm that didn't need announcing. The early light stretched across the fields in long golden bands, and for a moment, everything looked the same, the distant tree line unmoved. The fencing still standing, the gravel drive quiet. But something different hung in the air, subtle, like the feeling of a storm waiting far off the horizon, hidden but undeniable. She drove to the courthouse as the town began to stir, the roads still empty, the storefronts locked in silence. Her truck rumbled steady down the cracked asphalt, its bed empty, her passenger seat holding nothing but the manila folder she'd prepared weeks ago. She had signed everything slowly, deliberately, her signature steady across each form. Not just ink, but claim, intention, defense. The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of floor polish and aging carpet, a scent trapped in the baseboards no matter how many years passed. Alma stepped inside, nodded politely at the security guard, who barely looked up from his crossword, and walked toward the records window where a young clerk with over-gelled hair and a name tag reading Derek sat behind a smudged pane of safety glass. She slid the folder across the counter without a word. He glanced up, did a quick double, take as if expecting someone else, then took the documents with an exaggerated sigh, as though handling paperwork from a woman like her at that hour fell outside his job description. He scanned the top page, tapped a few keys, and muttered something about older filings being a pain to index. Alma said nothing, just watched. His fingers moved across the keyboard, too fast to be thorough. When the final confirmation screen appeared, he hesitated just long enough to glance toward the hallway leading to the sheriff's office. He reached below the counter, slid his phone from his lap, and, without shame or subtlety, sent a message, his thumb hovering over the screen like a man doing something routine but important. She noted how his eyes didn't meet hers when he handed back the receipt. No smile, no goodbye. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, the morning beginning to warm, but the chill in her stomach had nothing to do with temperature. The clerk had sent a message. Someone would be coming soon. They did. The sub arrived 2 days later, late enough in the morning that the fog had burned off, early enough that neighbors wouldn't see. It came up the drive slowly, tires too clean, suspension too smooth, a vehicle belonging in private parking garages, not gravel roads. Alma stood on the porch already, hands at her sides, waiting. She hadn't armed herself visibly, but her stance was enough. The man who emerged wore a deep navy suit, tailored but intentionally unbuttoned at the collar, a pair of brown boots smudged just enough to look worn, and an expression that tried to project concern but couldn't mask calculation. His blonde hair was combed back with practiced ease. Sunglasses hung from the second button of his shirt like a prop in a commercial. "Miss Reed?" he asked, stepping forward as if expecting her to meet him halfway. She didn't move. "I'm Nate Harlow," he said, pausing as if the name should mean something. "I work with a group that partners with legacy landowners, folks like yourself who've built something valuable and might be ready to transition into the next chapter." She raised an eyebrow. He pressed on. "I wanted to speak directly, respectfully, before things got too formal. You've got a beautiful piece of property here. Historic, good bones, under all this charm. There's real value waiting to be unlocked." He let that last word hang, like a salesman testing how far he could push before revealing his leverage. "I'm not selling," she said flatly. Nate smiled, but it didn't reach past the corners of his mouth. "Of course not. Nobody's asking you to rush, but we'd like to put something on the table so you know what's possible. We're not here to disrespect your legacy. Lord knows you've held this place down longer than most could, especially given everything else going on out here." He let his eyes sweep across the land, as if looking for evidence she couldn't manage anymore, as if the fall leaves and cracked dirt proved time had gotten the best of her. Then he took a small envelope from his inner coat pocket and placed it gently on the porch railing. "Take a look when you're ready. There's more zeros than trouble. That I promise." Alma didn't look at the envelope. She looked at him. "You came out here to tell me I don't belong on my own land." His smile tightened. "Not at all. I came to give you a choice. We like to work with folks who understand the world's changing. This isn't personal. It's just business. You've done well to hold this place, Miss Reed, but we both know land like this won't be quiet much longer. Might as well get something while you can still call it yours." There it was. Not in the words, but in how he said them. The assumption she didn't know what was best for her. The quiet implication that a woman like her, black, old, living alone on a tract white men now wanted, must have missed the memo that it was time to let go. He didn't say anything vulgar or raise his voice, but Alma had lived long enough to recognize the tone behind the manners, the control buried in the courtesy. She picked up the envelope, held it without opening it, and said, "You finished." Nate tilted his head, surprised. "Because if you're not, go ahead. I've got time," she continued, voice even but laced with steel. "But if you are, take your boots and your offer and get off my land before I make you forget every dollar in that envelope." He didn't smile this time. He gave a stiff nod, took one slow breath, and walked back to the sub without another word. As he drove off, kicking up dust that lingered long after the vehicle disappeared beyond the tree line, Alma stood still on the porch, envelope in hand, listening to the wind roll across her fields like a quiet warning already answered. The next few days unspooled with unnatural stillness, as though the land itself held its breath. The town, already shifting in tone, now felt drained of warmth entirely. People who once waved from porches or paused to catch up outside the feed store now crossed the street when they saw her coming, their eyes darting to the ground, as if her presence had become radioactive or worse, marked. No one said anything directly, but the silence around her felt less like absence and more like strategy, as though they were protecting something or someone by keeping her at a distance. She caught it in the way the store clerk bagged her goods without eye contact, or how the man at the gas station, who used to joke about the weather, stiffened when she pulled up beside him. It wasn't fear or pity. It was the expression she'd seen on young soldiers outside tents in far-off deserts. The kind that said they decided not to get too close, not to care too much, because they didn't want to feel responsible for what happened next. Back at the farm, the signs became less subtle. The first incident was the tire. She found it the morning after a rain, the ground soft enough to show boot prints in the dirt, though they'd been smeared by a sweep of leaves, like someone tried too hard to cover their tracks. The front driver's side tire of her truck was slashed, not deep enough to make noise or stop her immediately, but enough to fail if she'd gone over 40 on the highway, enough to flip a vehicle if the timing was right. She didn't swear or call anyone. She changed it, marked the location in her notebook, and took out a longer route map from her desk drawer, one with off-grid travel lines in case the roads became unreliable. A few nights later, her water line burst without warning. At first, she assumed it was age. The copper pipe had been installed decades earlier. But when she pulled it from the ground, she found the brake clean, too clean, snipped with something sharper than wear and time. That night, she boiled rainwater and drank it without comment. The next morning, she rerouted her filtration tanks and began storing emergency reserves in sealed containers. It wasn't until she walked the goat pens near dusk and found her eldest nanny goat lying on her side, stiff and bloated, that the line between warning and declaration was crossed. The animal had been healthy, old but eating well, moving steady. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of illness, only the telltale foam at the mouth and swelling in the joints that spoke of deliberate poisoning. Alma stood there for a long time, one hand braced against the fence rail, watching the last flies settle on the carcass like shadows with wings. She buried the goat herself at the edge of the north pasture, marking the grave with a stone she carved nothing into. That evening, as the sun slid low and the light stretched across the fields in long, honey-colored streaks, she descended into the cellar beneath the pantry and opened the reinforced cabinet that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. Inside, her sniper rifle lay in perfect alignment, wrapped in oiled cloth, each piece cleaned and checked every year on her birthday, out of habit more than preparation. She unwrapped it slowly, testing the scope, calibrating the zero, running her fingers along the stock as though reading Braille. It was an extension of her body, as familiar as her breath. She brought out her sidearm next, loading it with methodical care before sliding it into the holster clipped inside her waistband. She returned to the porch, not with fear or rage, but with a quiet sense of arrival, as though some long, dormant part of her had been waiting for permission to wake. The next few days were spent walking the land in measured silence, not to admire or harvest, but to catalog, diagram, and prepare. She moved through the fields with a tape measure, a compass, and a carpenter's chalk line, plotting distance against line of sight, marking every natural blind spot and elevation point. She sketched a map by hand, identifying angles of fire, backup shooting positions, and choke points near the fencing where her land narrowed between the oaks and the bluff. Tripwires were laid at shin height, looped with fine copper wire, camouflaged with straw. She rigged perimeter alarms using repurposed radios and pressure switches hidden inside overturned feed buckets. The windows were measured, blackout drapes trimmed and stitched with heavy cotton to absorb light. The barn was reinforced from within, not with planks or nails, but with anticipation. Every night before sleeping, she took a walk under the moon, counting her steps, watching for broken twigs, measuring silence by the absence of crickets. Then, on the sixth evening, as the shadows deepened and the air took on the metallic scent of approaching rain, the SUV returned. This time, it didn't come alone. 2 more trucks followed, darker in tone, headlights off, tires cutting slowly across the gravel. Alma stood at the edge of her porch, hands tucked into the deep pockets of her jacket, not moving, not blinking, as Nate Harlow stepped out of the lead vehicle. The man beside him was taller, broader, with sleeves rolled high enough to show military tattoos faded by time or poor choices. Nate didn't wear the same polished confidence as before. This time, there was no pretense, no envelope, no introductions. Just a long, silent walk to the bottom step of her porch, where he stopped, looked up at her with something that wasn't quite a smirk, and said in a voice stripped of charm, 2 weeks. That's all you've got to come to your senses. He glanced toward the house, the barn, the horizon. After that, he continued, voice low and even, you won't stop what's coming. You'll be real sorry you didn't take what we offered when it was still in one piece. She didn't speak or move. When he turned to walk back to his truck, the only sound was the wind slipping through the corn and the low hum of his engine idling in the growing dark. The night after Nate's warning passed without incident. But it brought a silence too clean, too complete, like the stillness of a hallway before a door bursts open. Alma slept lightly, boots beside her bed, rifle within reach, every breath measured, every muscle resting just beneath readiness. By morning, her decision had settled, not as a reaction to fear or pride, but as the only logical outcome when faced with a threat that no longer pretended to be anything else. She began her preparations the same way she had in the mountains of Afghanistan, walking the ground not as a farmer, but as a soldier, reconfirming terrain she knew by instinct. Every corner of her land became a variable in an equation, every elevation point an advantage to be marked and leveraged. She moved deliberately through the grass, kneeling often to press her palm into the dirt, testing for softness, measuring depth, accounting for how the earth would shift beneath the weight of boots. Not her own. The first tripwires went up at the edges of the west field, concealed by dried leaves, set low enough that no one would see unless they crawled. Copper wire stretched between posts that appeared to be broken fencing but were carefully placed anchors, each rigged to buried chimes and pressure switches connected to an old CB radio system she'd reconfigured by hand. When tripped, the signal would trigger a silent vibration beneath her floorboards. Not a sound, not a light, just a whisper through the house's bones that someone had entered the outer ring. Inside the barn, she cleared the central corridor, moved the animal feed to the far wall, and reinforced the door with 2 heavy oak beams she'd kept for just in case, though she never said what the case would be. From a trap beneath the grain bin, she pulled up a rusted tin box caked in dust, sealed with a code lock, her late husband's, untouched since the year he died. It took a moment to remember the combination, but her fingers found it before her mind did, muscle memory outpacing thought. Inside were old journals bound in canvas, filled with his small, meticulous handwriting notes on water lines, gas pressure levels, seismic readings taken long before modern scans confirmed what he suspected. Tucked in the folds of the final notebook was a laminated map marked with red grease pencil slashes, locations across the property, notated in a cipher only she and he could read, symbols for observation points, line of site corridors, fallback zones. Beneath the map, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the external drive, bearing no label, just a black shell and the weight of something left for survival, not curiosity. Alma set it aside, knowing it would come into play later, knowing the information it held would be a shield or a weapon. She spent the next 3 days wiring the house and land with hidden cameras small enough to nestle in tree hollows and fence rails, powered by solar units, feeding into a laptop kept under the false drawer of her writing desk. The screens flickered to life, quadrant by quadrant, until the entire property unfolded in real-time visuals. Every tree line, every gate, every approach visible through at least 2 angles. She watched them for hours, adjusting lenses, recalibrating angles, noting where her blind spots remained. That's when she found the first scout cam, placed high in a tree near the eastern slope, camouflaged well, but not well enough for someone who'd spent a career spotting glints of metal from hundreds of yards away. She climbed the ladder with care, removed the unit, and pried it open on the tailgate of her truck. It wasn't amateur tech, clean, small, feeding into a secured uplink. She smashed the internal chip with the butt of her screwdriver, tossed the shell into her burn barrel, and circled the perimeter until she found the second one, tucked beneath a false knot in the bark of an old hickory near the creek bed. This one she didn't destroy. She rewired the transmitter, looped its signal, and fed it footage from 2 days prior. Calm land, no traps, no activity, a still life to trick the eye. If they were watching, they'd see nothing at all. That night, she reached out to Jonah. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice rough from bourbon or sleep. Hard to tell which came first. "You back in the game?" he asked before she said her name. "Never left," she replied, voice low and steady. "You calling means you need a scan," he said. 4 square miles, stitched. I need heat signatures, recent tracks, anything crossing the timber line. I'll send it in 24. I'll pull from my NOAA backup. Should be clean. Make sure it is. If they're watching my land, they're watching everything. A pause followed, not from doubt, but understanding. "You alone?" he asked. "I'm enough," she said. He didn't argue, just exhaled through his nose and said, "You always were. Check your inbox tomorrow." She hung without goodbye. By the next morning, she had relocated her primary sniper nest to the old silo, its steel frame still stable despite the years, now cleaned and converted with sandbags, blackout tarp, and a mattress cut down from the guest room. From this height, she had clear views of the road, the northern woods, and all 3 approach paths. She opened her rifle case, clicked the magazine into place, adjusted the scope by half a notch, then lay prone with the stock pressed against her shoulder, eye aligned to the glass. Her breathing slowed, the wind whispering through cracks in the metal walls. She loaded the final round and murmured, tone steady. Not a prayer, not a curse, just the phrase she'd whispered in every country, every operation, every moment where the trigger was her language, and silenced the reply. 0 wind. The sky had folded into ink by the time the first vibrations reached the house's foundation. Alma, lying flat in the silo's loft, felt the subtle tremble through the rifle's stock before she saw anything. A rhythm in the gravel, soft but intentional, like boots trying too hard to sound like deer footsteps. She didn't shift or blink. Her cheek remained pressed to the stock, eyes steady behind the glass, the reticle tracing the moonlit slope to the fence line near the cattle gate. Then came the light, or its absence. 3 sets of headlights shut off in sequence as the trucks crept in slow, like predators circling when patience no longer matters. The vehicles fanned out without sound, doors opening with the caution of men expecting a fight but assuming they'd control it. Tactical boots landed in the dirt, gloves adjusted on forearms, suppressed weapons raised into ready positions. None looked up. They moved in coordinated silence, spreading into formation like they drilled it. She counted them as they advanced: 4 from the lead truck, 3 from the second, 2 trailing in shadow from the third. Their gear was sleek, dark, made for quick, clean jobs. They weren't here to threaten. They were here to finish. She exhaled once through her nose, slowly, and squeezed. The first man never heard the shot. The bullet passed through his neck just above the collarbone, the exit wound blooming silently across his left shoulder before his knees gave out, and he folded sideways into the grass like a sack of grain. The others didn't notice at first, too focused on spacing and movement to realize they were down a man. When they did, the second shot was already leaving the barrel, striking the next target as he stepped past a fence post wired with an old gravel mine. The shot caught him through the ribs, staggering him into the line. A second later, the wire snapped, and a burst of sharpened stone exploded upward from the buried canister she'd built from a repurposed fertilizer drum. The noise wasn't loud enough to echo, but cracked the quiet like glass, and someone shouted the word she'd been waiting for. Sniper. The formation scattered, but they were already too exposed. She shifted positions without hesitation, sliding backward on her belly, never lifting more than an inch off the floorboards. Within seconds, she was down the ladder and crossing the field along the irrigation trench, carved deeper over the last week to give a covered path between shooting positions. Mud clung to her elbows as she crawled, rifle slung tightly across her back, sidearm at her hip silent. Untouched. She didn't need it yet. They were firing now, blind, erratic, panicked. Muzzle flashes stuttered from behind the storage shed and tree lines, but the aim was too high, too late, too desperate. She could tell they'd trained, but not for this. Not for someone who knew the land better than they knew their own command structure. Not for someone who'd been killing in silence since before most of them could shave. She reached her second nest, tucked into the broken corner of an old hay barn, beams reinforced with sandbags, the crawl space beneath covered in burlap and coated with dust. The field ahead was scattered with movement, shadows bobbing between trees, someone calling out position numbers that meant nothing in terrain this uneven. She pulled the bolt back, fed in the next round, and aligned the scope. Another man dropped, mid-sprint, a clean shot to the thigh that toppled him face first into the ditch. He tried to crawl, dragging himself through wet grass, but she was already dialing the range to finish him. She didn't pull the trigger right away, watching him for a few seconds, his fingers digging into dirt, lips moving like he thought a prayer could stop what was coming. She pulled. The silence after each shot was worse than the shots themselves, settling across the fields like a second skin, draped over the earth as if daring anyone to speak, to breathe, to believe they controlled the night again. But they didn't. She did. Down near the eastern fence, one set off a second trap, a tripwire rigged to a garden hoe and a propane flare. The burst of light ignited the underbrush just long enough to expose two more targets ducked behind a pile of firewood. She couldn't hit them both from this angle but fired anyway. One dropped, the other ran, shouting into his radio for backup. She switched positions again. Each move calculated, each nest pre-built with small comforts earned through repetition: water bottles, a rolled cloth to rest her arm, a field map scratched into wood with nail points. She rotated through 4 positions before the trucks thought to reverse, before tires spun through mud in retreat, dragging the wounded and shaken back into their steel cocoons. The last thing they expected was to be hunted by a woman with gray in her hair and ghosts in her bones. The air inside the house had changed by the time she reached the back door. Not the smell of smoke, cordite, or blood, those came later, but a subtle disruption in air pressure, whispering of open doors and boots tracking across hardwood that had never known strangers. Alma crouched low behind the coat rack in the utility hallway, sidearm drawn, body balanced on the balls of her feet, breath shallow and measured. The breach hadn't been explosive. They were trying to stay quiet, to move like shadows in a place built for ghosts. But her ears caught every board creak, every whispered signal between men trained for urban raids, not for the house of a woman who'd spent her youth threading death through buildings far less forgiving. The first one moved through the kitchen, rifle angled low, flashlight flicking in wide arcs across cabinets and tile. Alma let him past the pantry before triggering the smoke bomb stashed in the oven's unused lower compartment. The room filled in seconds, thick white haze swallowing every outline. She moved through it like water, silent and precise, her shoulder grazing the breakfast bar as she ducked behind it and counted 1, 2, 3. The second man entered through the side window, feet landing softly on the kitchen mat she'd rigged with roofing nails punched through the underside. His shout was muffled, more pain than surprise, and she used the noise to mask her movement, sliding behind the first man and striking the crook of his elbow with the butt of her pistol. His weapon clattered from his grip. He turned, stunned, only to receive a sharp strike to the bridge of his nose. Blood splattered the fridge door as he stumbled backward into the sink. She didn't hesitate. Her left hand came up beneath his jaw, knife angled tight between fingers. She drove the blade into the soft space under the chin and twisted sharply left. He dropped without a sound. A flash of light to her right warned of the third man just before he opened fire. The bullet grazed her shoulder, the heat tearing through her jacket's outer fabric and biting into skin with a sting sharp enough to jolt but not slow her. She dove behind the dining table, already reaching for the second smoke canister, tossing it overhand toward the hallway as a boot struck the table's edge, tipping it sideways and sending plates crashing. The flare hissed as it ignited, spraying sparks into the stairwell. The hall lit up in bursts, pulsing red like a heartbeat too loud in the ears. She saw the shooter's shadow first, tall fast, moving too confidently. As he stepped forward, she fired from the ground, low and tight, catching him in the left knee. He went down screaming, the gun spinning from his hand and skidding into the baseboard. She rose quickly, shoulder burning, and retrieved the blade from her belt. Blood dripped onto the floor as she closed the distance. Breathing hard but silent, without ceremony she drove the knife into the base of his neck. He twitched once, then was still. A creak behind her, small, deliberate, someone moving slow. She didn't turn. Instead, she spun the desk lamp nearest her, casting its light across the far end of the hallway, then dropped low, crawling under the table as the intruder entered from the rear stairwell. She watched his legs move past her hiding place, steady, careful, his breathing controlled. He was smart checking angles, ignoring distractions, but not smart enough. Alma reached up and pulled the cord on the swing lamp above the bookshelf. The movement drew his eye for half a second, long enough. She lunged forward and stabbed upward, the blade slipping through the bottom of the lampshade and into his chest with a force that rattled the shade. He gasped, staggered backward, and collapsed into a chair, gurgling as his lungs filled with blood. Only then did she pause, leaning against the wall, panting, her hand pressed to the bleeding groove along her shoulder. It wasn't deep but would need wrapping. Not yet. Outside, the gunfire had faded, the others having retreated, regrouped, or been taken down by her traps and scope. Inside, the only sound was the labored breath of one last man, barely alive, face down near the kitchen entry, his rifle out of reach. Hand clutched around his side where she'd struck him with the blunt edge of her blade, knocking him unconscious moments before. She pulled a zip tie from her coat pocket, rolled him roughly onto his stomach, and bound his wrists with practiced speed. Then, with a grunt and one final breath to steady herself, she dragged his limp body down the hallway, through the back door, and across the yard toward the barn. Blood trailed behind, dark and glistening in the cold moonlight. The war had entered her house. Now she would take the fight into theirs. By the time she secured the barn doors and stepped back into the field, the land had begun to shift again. Not the wind or trees, but the air itself, thicker, heavier, pulsing with the tension that comes not from fear, but from the certainty that what's coming next is built for destruction. The first wave had been a test, an underestimation. The next would be something else entirely. She made it halfway to the front pasture before she saw the silhouettes. Larger this time, moving in tighter formation. Heads low, shoulders square, like they'd done this before in places where mercy wasn't part of the mission. The trucks didn't stop at the road. They surged forward, engines cut, lights off, tires rolling silently through gravel and mud, as if trained for darkness and silence the way she'd trained for silence and death. She counted 9 men on foot, moving fast, bodies bent beneath heavier gear breech kits. Shields, canisters strapped to packs, hammers in hand. Their movement was too clean for hired muscle, too reckless for law enforcement. From her vantage point behind the irrigation tank, she watched 2 approach the back entrance, crouched low beneath the living room window. One held a gas canister, the other a sledge, both looking up at the same time, nodding once before preparing to strike. She didn't wait. With a flick of her wrist, she triggered the trip wire running from the doghouse post to the base of the porch steps. The wire, invisible in the dark, snapped back the latch on a flare rigged above the gutter. In a sudden burst of shrieking light, the front yard ignited in a blinding white blaze. They staggered back, shouting for cover. But the confusion had already spread. 2 more men circling toward the south pasture ran into the claymore equivalent she'd buried beneath the false trough. The explosion wasn't deafening but precise, sending shards of jagged rebar and thick wet dirt into the side of the tractor and one of the attackers. She moved fast, darting from the tank to the garden trench, her shoulder flaring with pain at every stride. The leg wound from the earlier fight had tightened, stiffening with cold and dried blood, but it didn't slow her. She reached the comms jammer beside the compost bin, a reconfigured field radio connected to a solar power cell, and a frequency disruptor bought secondhand from a ham operator with questionable loyalties. She powered it on, slid the dial to the dead zone between law enforcement and commercial radio bands, and watched the green light flash once, then hold. Their radios were useless now. They wouldn't know why. Shots rang out near the barn. Wild, scattered, desperate. She dropped flat against the row of overturned soil, crawled to the fence post near the willow tree, and sighted in through the scope on her backup rifle. One attacker had taken shelter behind her wheelbarrow, firing into the dark like it might answer. She steadied her breath, exhaled, and squeezed. He dropped forward into the dirt, body limp before it landed. At the house, they finally breached. The back door splintered under the hammer's weight, the metal frame snapping with a groan that echoed across the yard, like a church bell fractured by fire. Alma knew they'd come through the kitchen first, that they'd stack, clear, and assume their speed gave them the upper hand. What they didn't know was that she'd removed the refrigerator from its spot and replaced it with a frame, mounted steel rod bent at an angle just above eye level. She reached the porch seconds after they entered, slipping through the broken siding on the north wall. Moving through the smoke-filled hallways, she used their confusion against them. Two were already blinded by the flash flares, rubbing their eyes, weapons swinging low. A third moved with intention, pressing through the smoke, barking orders that didn't match military cadence. She ducked beneath a swinging flashlight beam, pressed against the pantry wall, and waited for his boot to pass the threshold. Then she struck. The rod connected with the side of his head just above the ear, and he dropped instantly, collapsing with a grunt into the floorboards. She reached down to roll him over and froze. Nate, his face, even bloodied and slack-jawed, was unmistakable. The same smug curve to the jaw, the same polished arrogance now collapsed beneath her kitchen light. She bound his hands quickly, dragged him by the shoulders through the hallway, and left him behind the upturned dining table before returning to clear the house. When the sun rose, it did so without drama. The field smoked in soft tendrils, patches of churned earth glowing faintly in the new light. Her porch was littered with debris, broken boots, spent magazines, a gas mask hanging from the rail like shed skin. 3 were alive. 2 subordinates lay unconscious in the grass near the west field, stripped of weapons and gear, arms tied behind their backs with electrical cord. Nate remained inside, groaning, shifting slowly like he'd expected to wake somewhere softer, safer. Alma stood at the top of the porch steps, body slick with sweat and grit, the blood on her shirt a mix of her own and others. Her breathing was even. Her eyes scanned the tree line, the road, the horizon. When no more trucks appeared, no second wave behind the second wave, she exhaled slowly, let her shoulders roll forward slightly, and whispered the words her husband had once said after they'd survived a 36-hour siege in a forgotten compound. That's all of them for now. Then she stepped into the grass, boots silent on the blood-wet ground, and went to collect what they thought they could leave behind. The barn, in daylight, looked unchanged to anyone unfamiliar with its second purpose. The wide red doors, worn smooth by time and sun, hung slightly crooked on their hinges, the rusted latches bearing marks of years gone by. Inside, the space had transformed, not into something grotesque or monstrous. Alma never needed theatrics to make her point, but into a place where silence was thick and deliberate, every creak of wood or drip of water serving a purpose beyond its sound. The 3 men sat bound to reinforced chairs she'd bolted into the concrete days ago, each positioned at a slight angle, far enough apart that they couldn't whisper or see each other's expressions, but could hear everything. Their wrists were zip-tied, ankles secured with paracord, pulled tight against floor brackets. Duct tape had sealed their mouths during transport, now removed with a slow, deliberate hand, not to grant speech, but to measure their reaction to its return. Alma didn't speak for the first hour. She moved around them with quiet efficiency, adjusting lights on portable tripods, wiping blood from her temple with a cloth soaked in cold rainwater. resetting the battery on the small field recorder placed on the shelf above Nate's head. She let the barn settle into itself. The distant ticking of a roof leak, the wind pushing through slats high along the back wall. The slow rhythm of water dripping from a metal bucket suspended above the concrete near the far door. Every sound was intentional, none rushed. She poured water from a tin kettle into 3 canteens, left them just out of reach on the ground, then turned on a single hanging bulb that swung lazily above, casting long, shifting shadows across the barn floor. When she pulled up a folding chair and sat facing them, her expression was unreadable, not hard, not cruel, just quiet and entirely in control. "You came here to erase me," she said, voice low and steady. "You failed." No one answered. One subordinate, wary, younger, breathing through clenched teeth, shifted slightly. The other sat still, eyes closed, either conserving energy or pretending indifference. Nate met her gaze without flinching. Blood dried across his jaw where she'd struck him, his right eye swelling shut, but his expression composed, as if his training still whispered that posture was strength, even here. Alma stood, walked to the back wall, and picked up a small handheld speaker connected to her recorder. She pressed play, and the room filled with the sound of gunfire, boots in mud, distant voices shouting fractured commands from the night before. It wasn't just sound. It was proof, a timeline, a record of when they thought they were in control. When the recording ended, she turned to the younger man. "You want to tell me who's giving orders now?" she asked. He didn't speak. She nodded once, walked to the light, tilted the bulb into his face, and stood silently as the heat began to work on his resolve. 10 minutes passed, 20. Sweat formed at his temples, trickled down his neck. He shifted, blinked hard, swallowed dry air. Alma didn't touch him or shout. She moved the water bottle an inch closer, then stopped, letting silence do the rest. "I'm not dying for this," he muttered, voice cracked and raw. "Who are you dying for then?" she asked, crouching slightly, voice calm and even. He hesitated. "We don't know names, just layers. We're told when, where, how. The money comes from out of state. Transfers, cash drops, sometimes fake construction bids." "Heard Nate?" she asked, without looking at him. "Middleman." The man whispered. "He tells us what land to clear." She walked to Nate, crouched in front of him, meeting what was left of his gaze. "You want to keep playing the professional? Or should I let him keep talking?" Nate smiled tight, hollow at the edges. "You're not going to kill me, Miss Reed." "No," she said. "But I don't need to." She pulled a folder from the shelf. One of her husband's. She laid it open on the table beside Nate's chair, flipping through pages marked with land registry codes, transfer documents, surveys tied to the property surrounding hers. "You've been here before," she said. "Years ago. Quiet purchases, forced liens, families that left in the middle of the night. You were part of that wave, too. Weren't you?" Nate didn't answer, but the flicker in his expression was enough. She slid a photograph across the table, grainy, black, and white, taken from a drone years ago, showing Nate standing with Sheriff Vance outside a state land auction office. "You think no one was watching," she said. "You think my husband didn't see what was coming." Nate's lips parted slightly. He inhaled but said nothing. She leaned in, voice quiet, nearly tender. "You ever tell your daughter how you make your money, Nate?" "Because I will. I'll tell her, the courts, and I'll send the audio to every paper west of the Mississippi if I have to." His jaw clenched. "Sheriff Vance," he said finally, voice like gravel. "He gets the names, the filings. He knows who to lean on. The rest of us. Cleaners. Hearn the registrar," she asked. Nate nodded once. "Our job was to delay your paperwork. You weren't supposed to file in time. Once the window closed, we move, claim squatters' rights, stage a chemical spill, condemn the land. Same play as always." Alma pressed stop on the recorder, then stood. "You put me on a list," she said, voice low, filled with something older than anger. "You had no idea what kind of name you were crossing out." She walked to the door, opened it to the cold morning light, and let the silence hang behind her like a judgment waiting to fall. Inside the barn, the men remained bound, but the story had started to break. She didn't return to the house right away. Instead, she walked the edge of the property line, one slow step after another, boots pressing deep into the still, wet earth, the cold morning wind curling through the trees, with the hush that follows a night of violence. The barn doors stayed shut behind her, their interior cloaked in the weight of confession. Though the sun had crested the horizon, nothing about the light felt clean yet. There was a knowing in the air, a shift, not just in what had been done, but in what had been revealed. By the time she stepped through her front door, the adrenaline had dulled to a quiet ache in her joints. Her hands, still lined with dried blood, moved with muscle memory more than thought as she lit the stove, boiled water, and poured a cup she never drank. The cup sat cooling beside the window, while she reached into the drawer below the sink and pulled out the old green ledger she hadn't touched in years. The one her husband kept tucked beneath the third floorboard in the bedroom, marked only by a frayed ribbon and a faint cross on the spine. The journal wasn't what it seemed. It never had been. The first few pages were lists, fencing materials, feed calculations, rotational crop plans. But after the second section, the entries changed. The writing grew tighter, more deliberate, the dates sporadic. Alma recognized the structure immediately. Operational shorthand, used in the field when notes had to be disguised as logistics or inventory. Her husband, who'd walked away from service with injuries no one could see and a mind locked onto mission cadence, had embedded a cipher in his pages, just in case someone came looking to understand what he hadn't been ready to say aloud. She turned the journal sideways, angled it beneath the morning light, and followed the diagonal lines marked faintly in red pencil. Coordinates hidden in supply totals, names buried in expense columns. The patterns were old but familiar, and as she decoded them, the truth took shape with painful clarity. He had known about the gas years ago, not from a neighbor or company report, but from a quiet contract signed by an out-of state agency that flagged the mineral content beneath their land as high value. He hadn't told her, because he'd been working to slow the process from within, using outdated surveys and technical obfuscation to stall exploration permits. He hadn't wanted her to worry, thought he could buy them time. But someone found out. The entries near the back grew darker. Notes about meetings with a state officer who promised confidentiality, took copies of forged maps, and said he'd bury them beneath other filings until the political winds shifted. Alma read the dates carefully. One stood out, circled twice in black ink, followed by one more line in a hand that had started to shake. Meeting confirmed. Vance's name came up. Need to be careful. That was the last entry. Her husband had died in a single car accident on the highway back from that meeting. The truck found crumpled in a ravine. The report said the brakes failed. No autopsy was ordered. Sheriff Vance was first on the scene, personally delivering the folded flag and condolences. Alma closed the journal, fingers resting on the frayed edge of the last page. Breath shallow but steady. The noise outside, birds, wind, the distant groan of tree limbs, faded until there was only the pulse in her ears and the weight of understanding settling in her chest. This hadn't been about a land grab. Not entirely. Not just about the gas, the title, or the money. It had been cleanup, a final piece of a plan started years ago, unfinished because her husband had stalled them too long. She hadn't become a target just because of the mineral rights. She was a target because she was married to a man who'd made it his mission to keep those rights hidden and died for it. She stood slowly, walked to the living room, and opened the drawer where she kept the last photograph of him, in uniform, standing beside her the day they came home together for the final time. His smile in that photo wasn't forced or cautious. It was whole. So that's why they really came, she whispered, voice carrying the quiet finality of ceremony, not grief. Outside, the barn remained locked, the men inside unaware that the story had shifted again, not just in their failure, but in the reasons behind it. Alma sat at her husband's old desk and opened the field radio. Dialing a frequency they used to joke was for emergencies only. Static buzzed, then cleared. She keyed the mic and leaned in. "Jonna," she said, voice low but deliberate. "I need you to pull the accident report from March 23rd, 8 years back. Franklin County, 1 fatality. I want every line. Witness statements, signatures, the name of the responding officer." The pause was brief. "Copy," Jonah said. "That's going to take some creative reach." "I don't care what it takes," she answered. "And I want the drill site registry logs for anything filed near County Line 17 in the last 10 years. Look for aliases, out-of-state lelks, anything that crosses with Vance's name." He hesitated. "You're not slowing down, are you?" Alma didn't blink. "No." she said. I'm just getting started. She set the mic down and picked up the photograph again. There would be no more half measures. The house was still, but there was no rest inside it. Alma moved with a calm sharpened by clarity, her body worn but unyielding, wounds bandaged tightly beneath her sleeves. The storm had passed outside, but the real work, the kind built not on gunpowder but paper and proof, was only beginning. The confessions were fresh in her ears, but she didn't play them back. She didn't need to. Every word was etched into memory, and memory, unlike tape, didn't fray or skip. In the corner, the old field laptop hummed softly, its fan whirring just loud enough to remind her that this fight required precision of a different kind. She inserted the SD card, red, marked with an X in her husband's handwriting, a relic from before external drives replaced their field tools. The files loaded without error. She opened them one by one, checking audio levels, scanning for timestamp mismatches. Each file was labeled meticulously Confession 1, Nate Harlow, Confession 2, Operator 3, Confession 3, Target Sequence Breakdown. A master folder contained geotag, land records, corrupted transfer receipts, and a side-by-side comparison of delayed filings cross-referenced with Vance's name. Proof, not speculation. She encrypted backups to 3 drives. 2 physical, 1 virtual. One went into a hollowed-out floorboard beneath the hallway rug, another into a waterproof pouch buried beneath the azaleas in the west garden. The virtual version uploaded to a secure cloud hub run by one of Jonah's old surveillance contacts in Nevada, someone who owed them more than a few favors and didn't ask questions, unless trying to keep you alive. By noon, 3 identical packages sat on the table. Plain cardboard, sealed with craft tape, each addressed by hand. One to a small investigative newsroom in Mobile that chased corruption cases bigger stations wouldn't touch. One to a state government watchdog group that had sued Vance's office twice in the last 5 years. The third, heaviest, bound for a retired federal prosecutor running a legal podcast that had questioned the legitimacy of land seizures across the state's southern counties. Each box contained a thumb drive, a transcript, and a note in Alma's measured hand. You don't know me, but you know the pattern. Here's what it looks like when someone survives it. She drove the parcels herself, using the old truck with stolen plates Jonah sent last spring as a joke that became useful in ways neither expected. She mailed each from a different post office in 3 towns, pausing in none long enough to register as familiar. At each stop, she left a piece of her silence behind and carried nothing back but air. That night, with the barn secured and her house dark, but fully wired, she sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook to a name she hadn't written in years: Lena Hayes. She'd seen her once, years ago, giving a talk at a veterans' rights rally about environmental displacement and legal protections for underserved landowners. The young lawyer had spoken not with anger, but with clarity, rarer than rage in those who fought systems like this. Lena had since made a name challenging corrupt pipeline contracts, winning 3 injunctions against state-backed drilling corporations tied to interstate fraud. Alma hadn't needed her before. She did now. She placed the call just after 10. The phone rang 5 times before a calm, no-nonsense voice answered. Lena Hayes. This is Alma Reed. You don't know me, but you've been tracking my land. A pause, then the sound of a laptop keyboard tapping. You filed the mineral claim out of Franklin. 72 acres, filed late, but it stuck. That's right. What happened? They came for me at night, in numbers. Did you defend it? Yes, Alma said. I recorded everything. Lena's tone shifted, not disbelief, but engagement. Do you have documentation? 3 audio files, 2 names, 1 signed order blocking the mineral registration, forged by a county registrar. I have Vance tied to Lelksy transfers and a confession that includes the phrase, she was always on the list. A sharp exhale on the other end, then silence. I've got a press connection at the ledger, Lena said finally. And I'm 2 weeks from filing an ethics suit against the Energy Land Board. If I bring this to court, it changes the entire foundation of my case. Are you safe? Safer than they are. Good. Here's what we're going to do. They spoke for over an hour, moving through details like 2 officers planning a joint operation. Lena would coordinate the press release. Anonymous source at first, authenticated through geo-tagging and confirmed metadata. She'd file for an emergency injunction on Alma's behalf, then expand the case to include whistleblower protection once the information went public. A civil racketeering charge would follow, naming Vance, the registrar, supported by the filed evidence, audio confessions, and Alma's testimony. By the time Alma hung up, the legal fuse was lit. She leaned back in her chair, the ache in her shoulder settling beneath the surface, and stared at the old wood beams above. This house, battered, patched, braced against storms both natural and man-made, had held. It would keep holding. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, not howling, but whispering, as though the land itself had taken a breath. In the barn, the men remained tied, the recorder clicking softly on its timer, logging each hour as proof of life. Somewhere beyond the trees, far from the blood-soaked ground they tried to take, Sheriff Vance was starting to feel the tremble of something he couldn't stop. The barn stood quiet in the distance, its weathered siding cloaked in morning mist. The rising sun casting long streaks of amber across the yard. From outside, nothing stirred. But within its walls, beneath the steady click of the timer and the faint rustle of shifting weight, the unraveling had begun, not with shouting or violence, but with silence and consequence, a reckoning that moved like groundwater, slow, unstoppable, deeply rooted. The digital files were gone, scattered across encrypted channels, funneled to news outlets, legal archives, and government watchdogs with precise timing and complete anonymity. Nate's voice, raw from confession, echoed across audio logs that matched bank records and land surveys, connecting names and faces long hidden in plain sight. Every thread they'd pulled was a thread Lena Hayes could trace. In Atlanta, Lena moved like a machine, her office light never fully dark, her phone blinking with pings from whistleblower networks. Investigators and reporters piecing together the operation's scope. With Alma's help and Jonah's old radio scans, she charted a corruption web that bled beyond Vance's county badge or Nate's muscle. Into corporate acquisitions, political campaign donations, public grant misallocations, each layer hiding under the next like rot beneath polished floorboards. She followed money that crossed oceans, cycled through offshore trusts, bounced through four-digit shell firms, and reappeared as bribes disguised as property adjustments. She mapped it all and didn't speak until the picture stood complete. When the moment came, it arrived without fanfare. Federal raids moved just before dawn, deliberate and quiet, engineered to catch every door unlocked, every server online. Black subs rolled through gravel back roads and dark alleys, coordinated from a central command hub 2 towns over. Agents carried paper warrants sealed in tight packets, movements sharp as their timing. No announcements to local media, no early tips leaked. The silence was strategic. They hit 7 locations in under 30 minutes. 2 large estates, a private airstrip hangar, a satellite office downtown disguised as a real estate agency, a riverfront lodge used for off-grid retreats, and 2 nondescript homes belonging to State Energy Commission board members. Each housed boxes of unfiled paperwork, encrypted hard drives, and decades of liability waiting to be exposed. Alma watched none of it on television. She sat at her husband's desk, staring at the wood grain, hand resting on the radio she'd used to call Jonah days before. She wasn't interested in headlines or photos, had no desire to hear talking heads debate whether her actions were legal or excessive. The lane was still hers. Her name was still hers. That was enough. Meanwhile, Vance's attempt to flee unfolded with arrogance and desperation. He'd driven 3 states over in a rented SUV, carrying a forged passport with a Florida birth date and a Mississippi license number invalid for over a decade. He checked into a roadside inn under the name Leland Gibbons, paid cash, bought new clothes from a local hunting shop, shaved with trembling hands, and tried to vanish into the quiet places he once patrolled with impunity. But the net had closed. A state trooper pulled him over just past the levee, the vehicle flagged before he crossed the county line. Inside, they found burner phones, a stack of foreign currency, and a map with 3 border crossings circled in red ink. He didn't protest the cuffs, just looked into the trees as if they might offer one last escape. There were no more exits. Back on Alma's land, the men she'd left bound in the barn stayed where she'd placed them. Silent, still, in no position to run. She hadn't spoken to them since the final recorded confession. No threats, no questions, no gloating. Just food left within reach, water refilled, a heater humming low in the corner, enough to keep them from freezing, but not enough for comfort. When the first federal agents arrived, She met them at the gate with no weapon, only a folder containing passwords to the encrypted backups and the digital key to her logs. She pointed toward the barn and said, with a calm carrying no pride or hesitation, "3 inside, all armed when they came, all alive now." They nodded, thanked her, and proceeded without another word. The agents processed the captives without incident, noting the medical attention they'd received and the clear evidence of restraint, not cruelty. The men were shackled and led away, no longer soldiers or enforcers, but witnesses and evidence in a case they never thought would leave the county line. Nate, for all his bravado, gave a full deposition within 48 hours. Faced with a wall of evidence, federal charges, and accomplices eager to trade stories for lighter sentencing, he accepted the role of whistleblower. His testimony sealed 3 federal indictments and accelerated subpoenas against 2 sitting state energy commissioners. Back at the courthouse, Alma's paperwork, once stalled, lost, or conveniently delayed, moved through without friction. No more clerk side eyeing her, no more misfiled signatures or forgotten stamps. Her legal title was restored, mineral rights secured, ownership reaffirmed at every level. When asked if she'd appear in court or on camera, her answer was the same. No interviews, just closure. By week's end, the headlines had changed. What began as a missing permit case in a forgotten township became a national story of land theft, corporate conspiracy, and one woman's refusal to yield. But Alma didn't watch the broadcasts. She stood near the barn, staring at the scarred dirt where trucks had rolled in and bled out, where boots had pressed deep with arrogance, thinking she would fold. She didn't fold, and they'd never forget the cost of underestimating her. The indictments came swiftly once Nate's statement was entered into evidence. In a sealed courtroom session attended by federal prosecutors and forensic auditors, his confession, matched with GPS logs, recorded wire transfers, and internal correspondence from seized servers, became the keystone in a case quietly building momentum. One by one, state energy board members, city zoning officials, and regulatory agents who'd rubber-stamped illegal contracts began submitting resignations. Some cited personal reasons, others vanished behind non-disclosure agreements. But the headlines told a clearer story than any official memo. A coordinated effort to defraud vulnerable landowners for a syndicate hidden behind shell companies and offshore accounts. The men tied in Alma's barn were transferred to FBI custody by the time the morning sun peaked. She'd left the barn doors open deliberately so agents could see the evidence without obstruction. They found the captives fed, bandaged where necessary, seated beneath a blinking camera logging every hour of their captivity. Alma had kept everything clean. No bruises that didn't come from the fight, no injuries inflicted after surrender. They'd been given blankets, water, medical aid. One agent, after reviewing the footage, nodded and noted in his report, subject used non-lethal restraint and demonstrated clear intent to preserve life once targets were incapacitated. There were no further questions. As for those who didn't survive the night, their bodies were recovered with care, tagged and bagged by professionals who knew better than to ask Alma what happened in the dark. The evidence told the story for her. The propane flare near the firewood stack, the shrapnel pattern by the southern fence, the deep impressions left by breaching hammers clutched in dead hands. Each piece aligned with her account and matched timestamps from her mounted cameras. The federal report later classified all 10 deaths under defensive action taken during an organized armed assault, a legal term that carried no stain on her name. Sheriff Vance didn't run far. After failing to cross state lines with a falsified identity and a rental car procured under an expired drilling license, he was taken into custody by a quiet task force at the county line. His suitcase held more than fake credentials: a thumb drive encrypted with bribe records, land grab directives, and a partial list of targeted properties. Alma's name was circled in red ink. He had no chance to speak in court. His arraignment was closed to the public, and though his mugshot leaked within hours, the press release simply read, "Charged with conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice in a multi-state fraud case." He was denied bail. Lena Hayes handled the rest with surgical precision. She and Alma reviewed every document at the old kitchen table where the war began. Beneath the soft light of a single lamp, they laid out paths for restitution. Alma's mineral rights were not only honored, but secured under full federal protection through a clause in the Whistleblower Land Security Act. a provision rarely used but invoked given the attempted land seizure and violence she'd endured. The rights were irrevocable. The land could never be touched without her express permission. No more loopholes. No more games. When Lena offered Alma a seat on the advisory board for the new Land Protection Coalition, named in honor of her fight, Alma declined with the same quiet certainty she'd carried through the worst of it. "I didn't do this to join another room full of people with opinions," she said plainly. "I did it so the next black woman holding a deed doesn't have to pick up a rifle to keep her ground." Instead, she used part of her settlement, not hush money from lawsuits, but the clean federal payout tied to protected mineral claims, to establish the Reed Land Trust. Its mission was simple: locate, defend, and preserve black-owned farmland across the South. No politics, no cameras. Just quiet paperwork, legal firepower, and permanent ownership that couldn't be stolen by forged bids or buried clauses. The men who came for her never spoke her name again in court. Nate pled to a reduced sentence in exchange for everything he knew, which was considerable. The two men captured beside him accepted plea deals. Their silence traded for time. None saw the inside of her barn again. The land itself, the fields that had hidden traps and soaked up blood, grew quiet again, not in forgetting, but in the way trees remember storms without needing to speak of them. Grass regrew over the buried safe, fence posts stood tall, and in the far corner of the property, where the dirt ran redder than anywhere else, Alma placed no marker. She let the wind have that place. When asked later why she refused every media request, every feature article, every invitation to speak, she answered only once. To Lena, sitting on the porch one evening as the sky blood orange behind the hills. "They already got my story," she said. "I don't need to sell it back to them." The new boards on the shed didn't match the old ones. Smoother, paler, still smelling faintly of sawdust and fresh stain. But Alma didn't mind. She ran her hand along the grain, feeling the clean lines where chaos had torn through weeks ago. Around her, the sounds of rebuilding were soft but constant: the low scrape of a trowel, the rhythmic thump of boots against dirt, the occasional hammer tap on a stubborn nail. None of it was rushed. The volunteers who showed up didn't come with speeches or sympathy. They came with tool belts and thermoses, old habits from lives spent in uniforms, carrying quiet knowledge of what it meant to lose something and build again. The shed was first, but not the last. Across the western acres, a new structure rose slowly over the summer, low to the ground, broad in its footprint, with rooms opening onto wide porches and halls designed without corners. It was a retreat built not for ceremony or accolades, but for use. Veterans came from counties near and far, some wearing their fatigue in the curve of their spines, others in the way they looked at tree lines a second too long. They didn't ask what had happened on the land. The wind still carried the echoes, and the dogs ensured no one got too close without permission. But they respected the quiet, and that was enough. Lena visited now and then, usually on weekends, bringing updates on legislation, land rights victories, sometimes just cornbread and black coffee. She always parked in the same spot, just shy of the willow tree, leaning over the gravel drive, like it had listened through the whole fight. Alma kept her company on the porch, where the two women sat without urgency, without needing to fill the space with anything more than presence. Occasionally, they talked about the trust. How many acres had been added, what counties were next, how to handle new threats wrapped in friendlier language. But more often, they watched the sun go down. One morning, just after dawn, the front screen door creaked open, and a flash of brown fur darted across the porch steps. The pup was fast, full of bark and energy too big for his small frame. He circled the garden twice before running into a rake, knocking it over with a clang that sent birds scattering from the trees. Alma didn't flinch. She stepped slowly into the light, leaning on the cane now supporting her right side, and looked at the chaos unfolding in her yard. "Bullet," she called calmly. The pup stopped mid-spin, turned, and bounded back, skidding to a halt just shy of her boots. She crouched slowly, one hand steadying herself on her knee, the other stroking his head. "You'll learn," she murmured. "Everything worth protecting takes time." Each morning, she walked the fields again, not to the borders, as those paths were longer now, and her legs stiffened when the air turned cold, but enough to let the land see her, to know she hadn't forgotten what it cost to hold it. The cane tapped against the dirt with a rhythm that replaced the weight of a rifle, but it didn't mean less. She paused often. At the garden's edge, the slope overlooking the creek, the small patch where the blood had soaked deepest. And look not for intruders, but for life a new sprout, a bird's nest in the fence post, the tracks of a deer she'd seen once, but never again. When she stood at the center of the highest field, where the wind always came first, she let her gaze sweep wide across the open ground, then down to the house, then back again. She said the same thing each time, not loudly, not for anyone to hear, except maybe the land itself. I'm still watching. The breeze carried the words across the grass, past the repaired fences and fresh, turned soil, into the hollows where voices once whispered threats and now echoed only the sound of leaves turning over in the wind. Behind her, the house stood firm. Ahead, the horizon waited, not for war, not anymore, but for whatever came next. The grave was tucked at the edge of the north pasture, beneath a canopy of sugar maples that dropped golden leaves in October, and a cool hush year round. Alma hadn't been there in 10 years. Not because she'd forgotten or grief had turned her away, but because the silence between them was always understood. He'd once told her real love didn't need constant tending, that their bond was rooted deeper than words, place, or time. Still, that morning, she rose early, dressed without looking in the mirror, and walked the full stretch from the house to the tree line with a slow, deliberate grace that didn't ask the land's permission. It already knew her weight. She brought no flowers, just the flash drive. It fit between her fingers like something older than a modern device, more like a coin worn smooth by purpose, its contents heavier than plastic could explain. She knelt with care, knees resisting but not stopping her. The dew hadn't burned off, and the chill touched the hem of her coat as she slid the flash drive beneath the corner of the stone. It wasn't meant to last there, but to mark something. A final act, not a vengeance, but closure. The headstone was plain, as he'd asked, no rank, no war dates, no platitudes, just his name and the words, stand quiet. See far. Their old field mantra etched in stone. She sat back on her heels, exhaled once through her nose, and let the breeze carry her voice. They came here thinking I'd fold, she said, tone even, steady, not softened by sentiment or hardened by pain. Thought this old house was just that. Old. Thought I was past fighting. Thought you weren't still here. She glanced toward the horizon, then back to the name in the stone. But you married a sniper. The silence settled again, not empty, but full, stretched wide like the pause before a sunrise, waiting for memory to rise. The air around her seemed to slow, and what followed was not seen, but remembered. A flash of heat. Her younger self, hair pinned under a cap, breathing through the scope at the edge of a distant hill, heartbeat sensed with the wind, eyes sharp and unshaken, rifle grip steady. Finger poised not out of aggression, but duty. Then the softer warmth of her husband's laugh, sun-soaked and reckless, echoing from a jeep outside a tent in Kandahar, teasing her about how she never missed, how she made silence feel tactical. She'd rolled her eyes but smiled, because he was the one person who never looked at her like she needed fixing. Another memory bloomed the night he brought her to this land. Told her the soil was good, that it had veins of strength running through it, just like her. They'd stood on this field, watching the sky turn from copper to indigo, not saying much, just letting the future wrap around them without fear. Then that last conversation, years later, before he left for the meeting that cost him everything. His hand on her shoulder, the words he didn't say but didn't need to. Her unspoken promise, if anything happened, she'd hold the line, no matter the threat's shape. She blinked once, slowly, and the present returned. Her fingers grazed the stone's edge, not to clean or fuss, just to feel it was still there, that he was still here. Not watching from above, not whispering from the trees, but resting. Now, she could tell him it was done. She rose, using the cane for balance, and stood facing the pasture. Bullet sat nearby, watching with a tilted head, as if he knew this wasn't just another walk. You can rest now, she said, not to the wind or earth, but directly to the space between them. She turned and made her way back down the worn path toward the house, the cane tapping a steady rhythm, the flash drive safe beneath the stone, the sun rising strong behind her. The camera crew arrived late in the afternoon, their van rolling up the gravel path with cautious tires, as if their equipment understood it was trespassing on sacred ground. Alma had agreed to the interview only after they promised two things. She'd have the final word, and nothing would be edited to soften the truth. No narration, no dramatization, no pity. She wore a dark blue button, down, sleeves rolled past the wrist, and a silver pin at the collar that once belonged to her husband. Bullet lay by her feet as the director adjusted sound levels and tried not to stare at the rusted traps lined neatly on a shelf behind her. The old barn, now swept clean, smelled faintly of cut wood and earth, as if it, too, had prepared for this conversation. When the camera blinked red, she didn't speak right away. She let the air hold, let the crew shift uncomfortably in the silence. Then, eyes fixed past the lens, steady as the scope she'd once lived behind, she began. Not with a dramatic retelling of the night's violence, but with the soil. They didn't come for the house, she said. Didn't care much for the fence, the well, or the grass. They came for what was buried, and they thought I wouldn't know how to fight for something I couldn't see. She didn't raise her voice, or flinch when asked if she regretted anything. Instead, she spoke of history, not the kind in textbooks, but the kind written in deeds filed late, signatures forged, land taken without gunfire, just pressure, silence, and slow erasure. She spoke not as a victim, but as a sentinel, someone who'd seen the pattern long before the world caught up. The footage aired 3 weeks later in a prime time slot with minimal promotion, yet it spread like wildfire. Something about her presence, her refusal to be softened or made symbolic, resonated deeper than the producers expected. What began as a profile on a lone landowner resisting a corporate assault became a national reckoning. Hidden in the records Alma helped surface, alongside Lena's tireless documentation, was a pattern spanning 3 states, 5 counties, 7 families, all black, all targeted for mineral rights beneath land long written off as forgotten. One company name appeared on every paper trail, never at the top. Shell corporations like Green Horizon Lelfi and Southern Future Ventures, auction house signatures from frontmen with no digital footprint, land agents who vanished when subpoenas were issued. But the dots connected, and the federal probe expanded. By the time indictments were unsealed, over a dozen officials had resigned or were under investigation. Alma's case, once a backwoods anomaly, anchored a national scandal. She turned down every speaking engagement, podcast, and guest lecture invitation. She didn't want to be a brand. But she agreed to one last segment, filmed quietly on her porch with no makeup crew, no microphone clipped to her collar, just her voice and the rustling wind through the stalks. I don't need a statue, she said. Just leave the land alone. Let it rest the way we never got to. The last shots of the broadcast weren't of boardrooms or courtrooms, but of her hands planting seedlings near the edge of her property, where her husband once swore they'd grow their own food again, even if the world forgot how. Bullet nosed at the soil beside her, tail thumping, ears twitching in the breeze. In the distance, the rebuilt shed cast a shadow in the shape of a rifle rack, now empty, the wood polished but unarmed. A flag flew on a short pole nearby, not the national one, but a faded green banner with her husband's old unit initials stitched by hand. The land didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like memory given space to breathe. Years later, the land still spoke to Alma Reed in ways no courtroom or newsroom ever could. The pecan trees had grown taller, their branches heavy with fruit that fell in soft thuds against the earth each autumn. The creek, once clouded with runoff from the night of the assault, ran clear again, its banks lined with wild mint that perfumed the air when crushed underfoot. The fields, scarred by tire tracks and shrapnel, had healed under her care. The soil turned and seeded until the only signs of that war were the stories she chose not to tell. The Reed Land Trust had taken root as firmly as the oaks along the northern fence, its reach extending to dozens of families across 3 states, their deeds secured, their legacies protected by the quiet machinery of legal precision and unwavering resolve. Alma's days began before dawn, not out of necessity now, but because the early light was when the land felt most honest. She'd walk the property with Bullet at her side, the dog's boundless energy tempered by age into a steady lope, his nose still keen for anything that didn't belong. The cane was a constant companion, its rhythm against the dirt a reminder of battles won, and the body that carried her through them. She'd pause at the high field, where the wind always came first, and let her gaze sweep the horizon, not for threats, but for the simple fact of its existence, unbroken, hers. I'm still watching, she'd say, voice low. Not for anyone, but the land itself. As if it needed to know she hadn't softened, hadn't forgotten. The retreat she'd built on the western acres had become a quiet haven. Its porches filled on weekends with veterans who came not to talk of war, but to rebuild what it had taken from them. They worked the garden, repaired fences, or sat in silence under the wide sky, their hands busy with tasks that didn't demand explanation. Alma didn't lead them. She simply gave them space, a place where the weight of memory could settle without judgment. Some left after a weekend. Others stayed longer, finding in the land what she'd always known, a purpose that didn't need to be loud to be real. Lena Hayes remained a steady presence, her visits less frequent as the trust grew, but no less vital. She'd arrive with a briefcase full of filings or a thermos of coffee, parking under the willow tree that now leaned heavier over the gravel drive. Their conversations had shifted over time, less about legal battles and more about the future, how to train the next generation of advocates, how to spot the new faces of old threats. Lena had taken the fight beyond Alma's land, her work dismantling corrupt networks that stretched from county courthouses to corporate boardrooms. The indictments from Alma's case had been the spark, but Lena's relentless pursuit of the money trails turned it into a fire that burned through layers of deceit, exposing officials who'd thought themselves untouchable. Sheriff Vance's name faded from the headlines, his conviction buried under newer scandals, but Alma never forgot the weight of his shadow. His trial had been swift, the evidence overwhelming. Bank records, audio confessions, the thumb drive from his suitcase tying him to a decade of land grabs. He'd been sentenced to 20 years, no parole, his badge stripped. His name a cautionary tale whispered in county offices where clerks now double-checked filings with a nervousness they couldn't explain. Nate Harlow, too, had vanished into the system, his plea deal sparing him a life sentence, but not the shame of a name synonymous with betrayal. The men who'd survived that night in her barn never spoke of her, their silence bought by fear as much as legal agreements. The land itself seemed to understand what had been won. The pecan trees bore heavier yields, the soil richer each season, as if it knew the blood spilled had been a debt paid in full. Alma tended it with the same discipline she'd always carried, her hands steady as they planted, pruned, and harvested. The grave at the north pasture remained untouched, the flash drive still tucked beneath the stone, its contents a silent testament to a promise kept. She visited it only once a year, on the anniversary of his death, not to mourn, but to report. They're gone, she'd say, voice steady as the maples overhead. The land's still ours. One spring morning, a letter arrived, its envelope plain, but postmarked from a small town in Alabama. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, the script careful but unpolished. It was from a woman named Clara, a widow whose 40 acres had been saved by the Reed Land Trust after a drilling company tried to force a sale through forged documents. I don't know you, the letter began, but I know what you did. My grandkids will grow up on this land because of you. Thank you? Alma read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the green ledger beside her husband's ciphered notes. She didn't write back. Words weren't her way. But she sent a parcel to Clara's address, a small packet of pecan seeds, and a note in her own hand. Plant them deep. They'll hold. The world beyond her fence kept turning, its noise louder than ever. New laws, new fights, new names trying to claim what wasn't theirs. But Alma's land remained a constant, its boundaries unyielding, its story written in roots and stone. The volunteers at the retreat began calling her Miss Alma, a title she neither encouraged nor corrected. They'd watch her walk the fields, cane tapping, bullet at her heels, and see not an old woman, but a force, someone who turned a war into a legacy. They didn't ask about the scars on the barn or the redder patch of earth in the far corner. They knew better. The land told its own story, and she was its voice. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned gold, Lena sat with Alma on the porch, a rare moment when neither had papers to sign or battles to plan. Bullet sprawled across the steps, chasing a moth with lazy swipes of his paw. You ever think about leaving? Lena asked, not as a challenge, but as someone who'd seen enough fights to know the cost of staying. Alma didn't look at her, just kept her eyes on the horizon where the pecan trees met the sky. This land's all I've got left of him, she said. And it's all I need of me. Lena nodded, sipping her coffee. Letting the silence say the rest. The next morning, Alma woke to a sound she hadn't heard in years. A low hum, like a distant engine, too steady for a passing truck. She stepped onto the porch, cane in hand, bullet bristling at her side. Across the field, near the northern fence, a single drone hovered, its red light blinking against the dawn. She didn't flinch or reach for a weapon. Instead, she walked to the high field, slow but sure, and stood where the wind came first. The drone lingered, then turned, disappearing beyond the tree line. She watched it go, her face unreadable, then turned back to the house. "They're still looking," she murmured, not to Bullet, not to herself, but to the land. "Let them look." She returned to the barn that day, not to prepare for war, but to clean. The chairs where Nate and his men had sat were gone, replaced by shelves holding tools and seed packets. The blinking camera had been dismantled, its footage archived in the cloud hub, Jonah's contact still maintained. She swept the floor, the broom's rhythm steady as her cane, and opened the wide red doors to let the light pour in. The barn wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was hers, like the land, like the trust, like the name she'd carved into history without ever raising her voice. As the sun climbed higher, Alma stepped outside, Bullet darting ahead to chase a squirrel up the willow tree. She paused at the garden's edge, where the seedlings she'd planted with Lena's cornbread crumbs were beginning to sprout. The cane rested lightly in her hand, its weight a reminder, not a burden. She looked across the fields, the house, the horizon, and said the words that had become her prayer, her promise, her truth: "I'm still watching." The wind carried them away, past the fences, past the grave, into the hollows where the land held its secrets and its strength. Behind her, the house stood firm. Ahead, the future waited, not for war, but for whatever she chose to build next.